Hello everyone, this is Adam here with a video presentation on World War II. There's lots to cover, so let's get into it. First off, let's take a look at some of the major countries in this war. First up is the United States of America. The United States was on the winning side of the First World War, but it would not be so quick to join the Second. The US had pursued a mostly isolationist policy before the First World War, and it seemed that policy would continue. Despite finding the League of Nations, the US never joined it, and the Great Depression pulled them further away from foreign affairs. Despite the effects of the Great Depression, the US was one of the largest industrial economies of the world. Next up is the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom won the First World War like the US did, but had much more freedom to focus on foreign policy. The UK was initially hit pretty hard by the Great Depression, but getting rid of the gold standard allowed them to devalue their currency, which helped lift their economy out of the Great Depression. The Royal Navy was one of the strongest in the world, but it wasn't invincible, and Britain needed to prevent Europe from uniting against them. They also had a massive colonial empire which they would try to consolidate during the interwar period. Next we have France. France was one of the victors in World War I, but the impact of the Great Depression on them was different to the UK or US. Due to much of the working population dying in World War I, French unemployment wasn't that high in the Great Depression, but France wouldn't devalue the franc until 1936, while the British had done it in 1931, which hurt French production somewhat. French politics were quite chaotic, and many governments were formed and dissolved during this time. In terms of foreign policy, Germany remained France's greatest rival, and France led an alliance of smaller countries in Eastern Europe known as the Little Entente, in hopes of combating German resurgence. Next is the Soviet Union. The Russian Empire was on the side of the Entente in World War I, but poor performance in the war, as well as other factors, led to a communist revolution that plunged Russia into civil war. The Russian Civil War was a mess, with former German protectorates fighting for independence from the USSR. In the end, Russia had lost control over Finland, Poland, the Baltics, and the region of Bessarabia. After Lenin died, Joseph Stalin would quickly take his place and consolidate power over the USSR, forming a cult of personality. Stalin aimed to industrialize the nation at any cost, and while Soviet industrial production soared, his collectivization of agriculture led to mass famines and millions dying due to food shortages. The USSR was more cut off from the global economy, so they weren't impacted by the Great Depression as much as others. The Soviet Union wanted to gain back the territories of the Russian Empire, as well as spread communism further. However, Stalin took a more patient approach to this, promoting socialism in one country. Though the USSR still had a massive army numbering around 1.3 million, even during peacetime in 1936. Next up is China. I feel like many don't consider China one of the major allied powers, but they definitely fit the bill. China technically participated in World War I on the side of the Entente, but they didn't really do a whole lot. China was technically a republic, but in reality it was a dictatorship under Chiang Kai-shek. The collapse of the Qing dynasty in the early 20th century brought an end to imperial rule in China, and threw the nation into chaos. The Kuomintang became the dominant political force in China, and technically were supposed to control all of this, but actually it looked more like this. Many parts of China were under the sway of regional warlords. The Soviets influenced Mongolia and East Turkestan, and places like Tibet were de facto independent. The nation was also pretty backwards compared to nations like Japan, and struggled to industrialize and modernize. Now it's time to cover the Axis powers. First up is Italy. So Italy was actually on the winning side of World War I, but they wouldn't be part of the Allies. Italy became a fascist dictatorship under Benito Mussolini in 1922. You wouldn't expect such a big political change from a victorious nation, but it makes sense when you look into it. First, there's Vittoria Mutilata, or Mutilated Victory in English. When Italy joined World War I, they were promised parts of Dalmatia, which they didn't get in the peace conference due to poor Italian performance in the war, and the land was given to Serbia, later Yugoslavia, instead. Though, the main reason for Italy's radical transformation was the economy. Italy struggled to go from a war economy back to a peacetime economy, and Italy saw a major economic downturn that wasn't even related to the Great Depression. Mussolini marched on Rome in October of 1922, and with the support of King Victor Emmanuel III, Mussolini took over the government, eroded democratic institutions, and made himself dictator. Also, fun fact, it was actually Mussolini who initially popularized the Nazi salute, or Roman salute as he called it. However, despite Mussolini's grand dreams for Italy, the nation was not as economically, industrially, or militarily strong as other great powers. In fact, Italy's GDP was less than half of that of Belgium in 1930. Next up is Germany. Germany was on the losing side in World War I, and lost a lot in the conflict. Due to civil unrest in Germany because of a lack of food, and the toll of the war, a revolution occurred. The monarchy was abolished, and Germany would become a republic known as the Weimar Republic, named after the city where the Constitutional Assembly met. However, the republic was quite unstable. Germany was saddled with heavy war operations by the Entente powers, and after failing to pay them all, French and Belgian troops actually occupied the Ruhr region, which is an industrialized region of Germany, hoping to extract payment there. The Weimar government began printing lots of money, which led to hyperinflation. This political climate led to increasing radicalism in Germany. Anti-Semitism had been prevalent in Germany before World War I, but the defeat in the First World War had worsened it. The stab-in-the-back myth proposed that the reason for the German defeat in World War I was the fault of socialists and Jews betraying the German Empire. This, combined with a sense of ruined national pride after the defeat and loss of territory, would contribute to the rise of Nazism in the Weimar Republic. In November of 1923, during a time of economic and political strife, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party would take a page out of Mussolini's book and attempt to overthrow the German government. Nazi supporters gathered at a beer hall in Bavaria and attempted to overthrow the state government as a means to march all the way to Berlin and create a dictatorship. However, local authorities arrested Hitler and he was sentenced to imprisonment. While the Nazis had failed their coup, the incident would boost their notoriety, and Hitler would write his book Mein Kampf in prison. After this initial period of hyperinflation, the Weimar Republic would stabilize the economy and enjoy a period of relative prosperity until the Great Depression in 1929. This would send the Weimar Republic, which was dependent on American currency, into chaos yet again, and this time the Nazis would massively grow in popularity, gaining 36.7% of the vote in the 1932 German presidential election. Hitler wouldn't win the presidential election, but the winner, Paul von Hindenburg, would appoint Hitler as Chancellor. 4 weeks after Hitler became Chancellor, a fire would occur in the Reichstag, the lower house of the German parliament. Hitler would use this fire to declare a state of emergency. From there, Hitler would introduce the Enabling Act, giving him basically unlimited power, and when it passed, German democracy ended in 1933. Now that Hitler had control of the state, he began to undermine the Treaty of Versailles. Nazi Germany had a very revanchist foreign policy, being they wanted to take back their old lands, and also more. But to do this, Hitler would need an army far larger than the 100,000 men allowed to him by the Versailles Treaty. Germany embarked on a massive rearmament program. Jobs in defense manufacturing would also help the German economy, providing more jobs and helping it to pull it out of the Great Depression. Now moving into Asia, it's time to talk about Japan. Japan was technically on the winning side in World War I, being part of the Entente powers. They didn't do a ton except capture a few German possessions in the Pacific. After the war, they got most of the smaller German colonies in Asia. Under the rule of Emperor Taisho in the early 20th century, Japan adopted a constitutional monarchy and entered a period known as the Taisho democracy. Unfortunately, this democracy wouldn't last forever. The Japanese economy had already been stagnating, and the Great Depression led to the US putting massive tariffs on Japan, which hurt Japan a great deal as the US was one of their biggest trading partners. Additionally, this period of modernization led to upheaval in Japanese society, with noble and warrior classes losing a lot of their traditional wealth and prestige. The army was traditionally one of the most respected institutions of Japan, unlike the civilian government, and it began to act with increasing autonomy. Japan was not especially rich in natural resources, and their position as one of the most militarily and industrially strongest countries in Asia would push them along the path of imperialism. In Europe, Germany would go on to erode the Versailles Treaty, greatly expanding its military and using French and British fears of their bloody conflict to freely expand into Austria and Czechoslovakia. Meanwhile, Italy drew closer to Germany. Now that you're all caught up, let's dive into things. Germany sent an ultimatum to Poland, demanding the cession of the Polish corridor to Germany, but the Poles had an alliance with Britain and were determined not to capitulate to German demands, and so Europe was once again at war. At its peak, the Polish army numbered around 1 million men, but the German army was much larger and stronger. Poland had hoped to hold out long enough for the Western Allies to defeat Germany, but this was not the Allied plan. The Germans had more tanks and aircraft, and only a few weeks into the invasion, the Soviet Union also invaded Poland with their army, which would doom Poland, and the country would be divided between Germany and the USSR. The Germans would go on to commit countless genocidal atrocities against Jews in this area, and the infamous Auschwitz was actually built in Poland. In the West, Germany only had around 20% of its army, despite being near the French border, but the Allies did not attack. In fact, despite being at war, pretty much nothing happened on the Western Front for a while, which is why this period is known as the Phony War. The Allied war plan did not involve a speedy two-front invasion of Germany. The Allies were prepared for another World War I. The plan was to hold the West and enact a blockade of Germany, giving the Allies time to build up and letting the Germans attrition until they were ready to invade Germany proper. But back in the east, the USSR was making some moves. The Russian Empire used to control Finland, but it had broken away from Russian control during the Russian Revolution. Finland was against communism, and its border was very close to the major Soviet city of Leningrad. The West was busy fighting Germany, and Finland was included as part of the Soviet sphere of influence in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So on the 30th of November 1939, the USSR invaded Finland. But unfortunately for the Soviets, the Finns were very prepared for this war. The Soviets took heavy casualties, around 300,000 in total. This was a major embarrassment for the Soviets, considering the disparity between the two. The Soviets did eventually break through the initial Finnish defenses, but their offensive was still sluggish, and they feared Franco-British intervention. The Finns and the Soviets agreed to a conditional surrender. The USSR would get some Finnish territories, but Finland wouldn't become a Soviet puppet like Stalin wanted. This military disaster sparked major army reforms in the USSR. After securing Poland, Germany went on a campaign against Norway. Sweden was one of Germany's biggest suppliers of steel, and Germany wanted to secure imports of steel. So on April 9, 1940, Germany would first invade Denmark. Denmark couldn't exactly stand up to Germany, so they surrendered in just 6 hours, becoming a German protectorate. Germany used Denmark as a stepping stone to launch an amphibious invasion of Norway. Despite the British Navy being far superior to the German one, German air superiority in the region allowed tremendous success in Norway. The Germans would quickly overrun most of the country. This Allied failure was a big blow to Britain, as Germany had managed to beat the UK at their own game. The failure in Norway was a big discredit to Chamberlain, and he was replaced by Winston Churchill, who would be a much better war leader. On May 10, 1940, Germany began a full-scale invasion of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. This invasion was made to bypass the Maginot Line, a series of fortifications on the French border with Germany. The Low Countries had been neutral up to this point, and their armies hadn't mobilized and Allied troops hadn't entered their borders yet. This gave Germany a large head start, and they managed to occupy large parts of Belgium and the Netherlands before Allied troops could arrive. German tanks managed to break Allied defenses, and tank commanders ignored orders to slow down, eventually reaching the Channel coast. Here, Germany had encircled some of the French and Belgian armies, as well as the bulk of the British Expeditionary Force. The forces there managed to hold the line against German offensives, and most of the British managed to evacuate, but their equipment could not be brought back. By now, the Germans outnumbered the French, and they began a massive offensive into France. As the French army began to collapse, Mussolini took the opportunity to launch his own invasion of France, in the hopes that the war would soon be over and Italy would be able to gain land in a potential peace settlement. Unfortunately for Mussolini, Italian troops failed to cross the Alps, and the war against Italy would be one of the few French victories in 1940. As the Germans advanced further, World War I hero Marshal Philippe Pétain became Prime Minister of France. He would sign an armistice with Germany, allowing Germany to occupy most of northern France. The rest would be ruled over by Pétain himself. Pétain was an authoritarian leader who would be the dictator of the French rump state. His regime is known as Vichy France, named after the city that housed its government. Charles de Gaulle, a French military officer and government official, would also arrive in London to form a French government in exile. He encouraged the French people to resist the German occupation. Unfortunately for de Gaulle, Pétain's regime was internationally recognized as the legitimate government of France, and most of the French colonial empire would side with Pétain. Despite this catastrophe, Britain would keep with the fight, and Winston Churchill was making his famous "We will fight on the beaches" speech. When the British refused to surrender, Germany decided the next step in a war with Britain was to establish air superiority over Britain. The British Royal Air Force and the German Luftwaffe fought for months, but eventually the British managed to defeat the Luftwaffe, destroying around 2,000 German aircraft. After this defeat, Germany would be forced to turn away from an offensive campaign against Britain. Meanwhile, Italy was in a tough spot. Declaring war on the Allies wasn't something Italy could take back, and despite France being out of the picture, Italy still bordered British colonies in Africa. In September of 1940, Italy attempted to invade British-controlled Egypt. Despite having 4 times the soldiers of the British, the Italians had less tanks, and the ones they did have were quite bad. So they actually lost ground to the British during Operation Compass. But eventually, German General Erwin Rommel arrived in February of 1941 with his own tanks, and he managed to reverse the British gains and push into Egypt. But Axis forces failed to secure the crucial port of Tobruk, and the offensive faltered. In Italian East Africa, things went even worse. The Italians were completely pushed out of their East African holdings by November of 1941. Italy had a lot of different fronts they failed on, so I have to jump around through time a bit. In October of 1940, Italy invaded Greece through their Albanian puppet state. Mussolini expected an easy victory to expand the Italian Empire and reassert Italy's status. Unfortunately for Mussolini, this invasion would be a catastrophic failure. Greek troops actually pushed Italian troops back into occupied Albania. Despite having outdated equipment, Greece managed to secure several victories against Italy. Then, much later, on the 6th of April 1941, Germany and their new Axis allies, Hungary and Romania, and Italy would invade Yugoslavia after a coup overthrew the pro-Axis government there. This invasion of Yugoslavia was one of the few success stories for Italy, though it helped that there were hundreds of thousands of German troops, and Yugoslavia was basically surrounded. The defeat of Yugoslavia, combined with Bulgaria joining the Axis, allowed for Germany to help bail Italy out of their disastrous war in Greece. With German help, the Allies were pushed out of Greece, though this whole thing delayed the German invasion of the Soviet Union. A German invasion of the Soviet Union might seem unexpected, but it makes a lot of sense when you look into it. The German war machine took a lot of oil to operate all of its planes and tanks. However, there wasn't much oil in the land Germany had sway over. There was some in Romania, but it wouldn't be enough to fuel the whole war. However, the Soviets had a lot of oil, particularly in the Baku oil fields of Azerbaijan. The Soviets were happy to trade oil with the Germans, but Germany was paranoid the USSR would cut off their supply any moment, leaving the Axis unable to wage war. There was also the more ideological reason for it. The idea of Lebensraum, which roughly translates to living space, involved creating more land for Germany, especially in the east by committing genocides against the people living there. The USSR was also communist, and the Nazis were very opposed to communism. There was also the fact that the Winter War had shown serious weakness in the Soviet military. So on the 22nd of June 1941, the Axis would launch a full invasion of the Soviet Union. Despite intelligence suggesting otherwise, Stalin was convinced there would not be a German invasion. So Soviet preparations were lacking, though it's not like the Soviet hadn't expected a war to break out at all. This helped the initial Axis invasion. The German Air Force also managed to secure several victories against the Soviet one. Around 4,000 Soviet planes were destroyed by German airstrikes while they were still on the ground in air bases before they could actually get off the ground. Also, contrary to popular belief, the Axis actually outnumbered the Soviets in the early stages of Barbarossa, with around 3.8 million Axis forces facing around 2.8 million Soviet ones, although the Soviets had much greater reserves. Finland would also join the German war, declaring war on the Soviets in hopes of regaining lost territories after the Winter War. The Germans scored several massive victories, encircling around 600,000 Soviet troops in Kiev alone. But this string of German victories wouldn't last forever. The Germans were still on the offensive, but the rate of their advance had slowed down considerably by winter. Famously, the Germans managed to get very close to the Soviet capital of Moscow, but failed to take it. While the Soviets suffered heavy casualties, they had significant reserves who were mobilizing every day to replace the ones lost. German logistics were also an issue. They had advanced quite far from Berlin, and their supply lines were beginning to stretch. Meanwhile, the Soviets received thousands of trucks from the United States as part of Lend-Lease, improving their logistical capabilities. The war was also a very existential one for the Soviets, as I discussed before about the Nazi plans to commit mass genocides in the area. The Eastern Front was also known as the Great Patriotic War in the USSR. But now back in Asia, Japan was eager to exploit the French defeat. Japan was in a defensive alliance with Germany and Italy through the Tripartite Pact, and Japan had pretty good relations with Germany. This led them to assert control over Indochina, which was a French colony currently under the control of Vichy France, a German puppet. Japan had briefly invaded the territory earlier, and had been allowed to set up a garrison there as a result. But on the 28th of July 1941, Japan invaded the territory and gained control over it. This sent shockwaves through the international community, as Indochina could be used as a staging ground for potential Japanese invasion of European colonies. This action led to the United States placing an embargo on Japan, no longer selling oil to them and freezing Japanese assets. This embargo was a pretty huge problem for Japan. They desperately needed oil to fuel their war in China, and the US was one of their biggest suppliers. Without oil, Japan's war effort would be doomed, but there was lots of oil nearby. Dutch and British colonies in Southeast Asia were rich in oil as well as other resources vital for war, and Europe was currently very distracted at the moment. Unfortunately, the United States is a lot less distracted. An invasion of Southeast Asia would likely trigger an American response, especially considering the US held control over the Philippines, and it could threaten the Japanese Navy in Southeast Asia. So Japan concocted a plan known as Operation I, though you might know it as the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese plan was to inflict severe damage on the US Pacific Fleet, paralyzing the US Navy long enough for them to consolidate control over East Asia to the point where the US would be unwilling to continue a war against the Japanese. So on December 7, 1941, Japan would enact their plan. Unfortunately for Japan, this plan wouldn't really work out exactly as they'd hoped. The attack did destroy several US ships, but the aircraft carriers weren't in Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack, and the Japanese also greatly underestimated the psychological implications of the attack on the American public. Instead of making the US scared of fighting Japan, it did the opposite. This direct attack on US soil galvanized the US for war. However, this wouldn't stop Japan, and they would still take the opportunity to invade Southeast Asia. Japan would quickly invade the Philippines, British Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Japan would also briefly invade Thailand, which resulted in Thailand signing an armistice with Japan and becoming their ally, helping Japan invade Burma, now Myanmar. Japan invaded Burma to cut off Allied supply to China, though this invasion also led to the Bengal famine in India. Now back in Europe, Germany declared war on the United States on December 11th of 1941. Now, Japan was in a defensive alliance with Germany, but Japan had hit first, so there was actually no reason for Hitler to do this. It was likely to show solidarity with Japan in hopes they would open up a second front against the USSR in Manchuria, but they would not do that. Though to be fair, the US probably would have started helping in Europe anyways, though this declaration of war certainly didn't slow them down. The US pursued a Europe-first strategy, mostly because they'd been pushed out of Asia by Japan's fast invasion, losing the Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam. And Germany was seen as the biggest threat to their major ally of Britain in the USSR. In July of 1942, the Germans would undertake what would be their last major offensive on the Eastern Front. The Germans hoped to seize the Baku oil fields in Azerbaijan, which would boost their supply of fuel while denying it to their Soviet enemies. The Germans saw impressive initial gains, but their offensive soon faltered before they could reach any major oil fields. Famously, around 330,000 Axis troops fought in the Battle of Stalingrad around this time. These troops were encircled by the Soviets and suffered from heavy attrition before finally surrendering. Stalingrad was a major turning point on the Eastern Front, and the war shifted in favor of the Soviet Union. With the US now on the Allied side, the Allies could begin more major operations. In November of 1942, Allied forces invaded Vichy French North Africa. The Allies captured much of Algeria and Morocco, but had faced stubborn resistance in Tunisia. As the Soviets defeated the Germans at Stalingrad, they attacked the German army in the Caucasus, and managed to reverse most German gains. From this point, the Germans and the Soviets would engage in many battles, with the Germans advancing in some areas and the Soviets making counterattacks. A major and notable turning point was the Battle of Kursk. After the German offensive Operation Citadel had failed, the Soviets took the opportunity to attack the exhausted German troops. The Soviets dealt heavy casualties to the Germans, and the Battle of Kursk is one of the largest battles in history. This was a major turning point in the Eastern Front, as the Soviets would only gain more momentum. Meanwhile, the Western Allies were preparing to invade what Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. Can you guess who that is? Yeah, it's Italy. After defeating Axis forces in Tunisia and mopping up the last of Italian control over Libya, the Allies could finally invade Italy. They started with the island of Sicily. The Allies landed in Sicily on the 9th of July, and they managed to secure the island after a few months of fighting. As the Allies prepared to invade the rest of mainland Italy, Mussolini's popularity was now abysmal. The war was not going in his favor, and Mussolini was quickly deposed and imprisoned. The Italian government was preparing to surrender to the Allies, but German troops quickly occupied Italy to prevent them from surrendering. Mussolini was broken out of prison by German troops, and he was made to rule northern Italy, which was now a puppet state under German control. Italy would descend into a kind of civil war, with the Allies and their supporters in the south and Mussolini's regime in the north. Unfortunately, the Allied advance in Italy faltered, as the Gustav line of fortifications halted the Allied advance. As the offensive in Italy faltered, the Allies looked to the west as a potential area to open another front against the Axis and take pressure off the Soviets. The Allies devised Operation Overlord, a plan that involved an amphibious invasion of Normandy to liberate France. The Allies embarked upon a deception campaign with fake troops and radio chatter, hitting an invasion of Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. This caused the Germans to divert a bulk of their forces to this false location. In June 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy, and managed to secure a beachhead, defeating German forces and launching an offensive into France. By now, the Soviets have been pushing hard against the Southern Axis front, even reaching all the way to Romania, but then the Soviets made a push against the German Army Group center. The Germans thought the Soviets would make another attack against the south, but instead, the Soviets made a large push against the Germans to the north, getting lots of land and dealing more casualties to the Germans. The situation for Germany is becoming increasingly dire by this point. They have failed to repel Allied invasions of the west, and can't stop the Soviet tide in the east. Germany began producing Wunderwaffe, which means wonder weapons in English. Weapons like the V-2 rocket, which are impressive, but don't have enough impact to meaningfully change the war. As a desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war, the Germans hoped to recreate the success they had at Dunkirk, hoping to encircle the Allies in Belgium yet again. But while the Germans were reusing the same strategies from 5 years ago, the Allies had adapted. The shattered remnants of the Luftwaffe and the German army managed to catch the Allies by surprise, but after a few weeks, all momentum was gone, and the Germans had wasted some of their last armor reserves in aircraft. The Soviets continued to move west, and as the reality of the war began to set in, pro-Axis governments in Romania and Bulgaria capitulated to the Soviets as the Red Army entered, though German occupation prevented a Hungarian surrender. Most of Yugoslavia had been liberated by Tito's partisans, and in the north, the Soviets reached Poland and began to move towards Berlin. The Soviets reached and encircled Berlin. Hitler soon committed suicide in his underground bunker. After Hitler's death, German Admiral Karl Donitz takes control of what remains of Germany, and he quickly surrenders unconditionally. By May 9, 1945, the war in Europe is finally over, but there's still Japan to contend with, and now the Allies are free to focus on the Pacific front. The Allies engaged on an island-hopping campaign, pushing Japanese naval power by taking smaller islands the Japanese had control over. Iwo Jima and Okinawa were some of the closest to Japan. The Japanese army fought fiercely, but eventually the islands fell, allowing for Allied operations very close to Japan. The Allies knew a naval invasion of Japan would be incredibly difficult, as the Japanese resistance would be incredibly fierce. It would likely lead to heavy casualties on both sides, so the Allies decided to try and get Japan to surrender unconditionally without having to land troops on the home islands. The United States had developed the atomic bomb, and on August 6th, one was dropped on Hiroshima, and on August 9th, another one was dropped on Nagasaki. Somewhere around 200,000 people were killed in these bombings, which is a high amount, but the number is similar to the amount who died in Allied firebombing campaigns. Also on the 9th of August, the Soviet Union launched an invasion of Japanese-controlled Manchuria. The already overstretched Japanese army was unable to resist the Soviet attack, and Manchuria fell within weeks. Manchuria had long been the breadbasket of Japan, and its fall also meant the end of Japanese operations in China. All of this meant the Soviet invasion of Manchuria was a huge blow to the Japanese. Both of these factors led to a Japanese surrender on the 2nd of September, 1945, and the Second World War was finally over.